Today, I'm delighted to be joined once again by Ben Hodges, a retired United States Army officer who became commander of the US Army Europe in November 2014 and held that position for 3 years until retiring from the Army in January 2018. Until recently, he was the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, specializing in NATO, transatlantic relationship, and international security. Before we jump in, thank you to everybody who is supporting the channel, including the various events that we are running here and, of course, all over Europe. Your support is incredibly important. It really does help to get the Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon and so on, to get the logistics, to hire film crews, and to all the stuff that it takes to bring these extraordinary events and the extraordinary experts to the channel so that everyone can see them. Ben, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you back again.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for the privilege, and I'm happy to see you healthy after your recent visit to the front.
Yes. I'm all limbs intact, fortunately, which is great news. But of course, we did see people who were not so lucky, and yeah, one of those is incredibly moving. A Polish volunteer. He wanted to remain anonymous because he fears reprisals against his family. And we managed to film the video. It's on the channel if people are interested. He's recuperating after losing a limb, stepping on a mine, but is intent to go back to join a drone unit. And that's an interesting impression. I guess there's perhaps a difference there. In a Western army, people who've sustained massive injury and possibly an element of PTSD as well would not necessarily be sent back to the front. There wouldn't be a role for them. Now we're seeing these people become drone operators, trainers, planners, all sorts of roles open to people who've lost, one or sometimes even more limbs. What's your impression of that?
Well, I think people like that, there's all kinds of emotional reasons that they would want to go back. Soldiers that are wounded are always regret that they left their teammates. They're the guys that they had been with. I remember visiting a lieutenant who was the son of a friend, a classmate of mine, who had been severely injured in Afghanistan. And when I went to see him there in the hospital that night, he was in tears because he knew he was now going to be losing his platoon. He was going to be away from his soldiers who were still deployed. So I think that's a natural reaction. But I would imagine also soldiers who do this would be having some tough conversations with their spouses or their kids to say, I've got to go back. But this is why, when President Trump was yelling at President Zelensky in the Oval Office in that terrible meeting back, I think there at the end of February, and he was saying, "You got no cards," me because Ukraine was so outnumbered. That told me that the administration has no clue about why people fight, about that it's not just a math problem. And so people that lose a limb and want to go back and kill Russians, take that risk, I'd say that they have a lot of cards.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because since then, we've seen a sort of roller coaster of so-called sort of negotiations, from an appalling version of the minerals deal, which was absolutely exploitative and abusive. We now seem to have ended up back at something that is closer to the second draft. It's more of a licensing deal on future extractive operations and other areas of the economy. But it is not. I would describe it from what I've seen, what I've read. It does not look exploitative at this level. In fact, you could even describe it perhaps as a symbolic political win rather than delivering any immediate advantage. Without getting into the sort of political roller coaster of it, what's your impression of it? Because it does seem that this new deal has already unlocked an arms sale. And of course, the press and some of the press who prone to, let's say, normalization of this abnormal situation, saying, well, here we go, the US, boom, it's right back behind Ukraine. But it seems to me that this arms shipment is also fairly symbolic rather than substantive. And indeed, the minerals deal itself is a political win, again, rather than something incredibly strategic. So, What is that your impression, and what's going on?
Well, honestly, it's hard to say. Because there has been so much noise around this, and I think many of us are a little bit confused about what was in the original deal, what was in this deal. Um, and there's nothing normal. I'll just say it like that. There's nothing normal about how this U.S. administration does things in the traditional sense. Um, Still, I think it's better than nothing because it does, at least the U.S. is now going to sell weapons to Ukraine. But the amount of money that we're talking about in the great scheme of things is not that significant. I mean, it means a dozen Patriot interceptors, for example. I mean, that's it. Again, better than nothing. But I think I don't know that this represents a major turning point that the Trump administration is prepared to now go all in with Ukraine. Certainly, it will be a very long time before there's any I would think a significant gain from whatever extraction is going to be done from the mining. And I don't think that having a U.S. company out there mining is going to be a real deterrent to Russia launching missiles against Ukrainians in that area. Um, having said that, um, I think that the Russians can't be too happy about this because I think that they probably thought that they had the U.S. administration all wrapped up, sewn up, and now they probably have to be recalculating.
And certainly some of the propagandists seem to be questioning the extent to which Trump is their man. And for all those, in the comments were like, you're always saying negative things about Trump. I mean, Russian propagandists have had a high degree of hubris, I think, over the last since the election of Trump, and they have claimed that he's their guy and he's acting in their interests. Of course, some of the things he's done are demonstrably in the Russian interest, not what's happening now, at least some of the optics of it. I think that's an interesting point, is this overreach and hubris of the Russians. Trump may well, through the minerals deal, have been offering them a way out, a way to end the war and save face. I think that partly, I think he is keen to end the war because then he can get on with making money, which is the thing that, he's most interested in. Do you think Putin may have squandered this opportunity, this olive branch that was being offered to him, and he may have burnt his last get out of jail free card in terms of the war?
It seems that way. I mean, what the Trump administration was pushing, which does not mean that Ukraine would have accepted it or that Europe would have gone along with it. But what the Trump administration seems to have been pushing would have been a pretty damn good deal for the Russian side, more than they could have reasonably, certainly more than they would have gotten from the last administration. And I'm glad that Russia didn't take it because I think some of the things that the Trump administration was pushing were egregious. Um, but I have always sort of hoped that because President Trump is very transactional in how he approaches things, that in a way that sort of gives him the flexibility to do hard left turn or hard right turn or a complete about face. If he's not getting what he wants, then okay, screw you, and then completely change. And so I had hoped that the Russians at some point would annoy him so much because they were making the president look foolish. He obviously was not going to solve this in 24 hours or even 3 months. And so the president has a lot of leverage over the Russians that he didn't before. He could open the floodgates on aid, no restrictions, quantities, you name it. And the Congress, I think most of the Congress would certainly support that. Or he could do things that would crush Russia's oil and gas industry by working with allies to shut down Russia's ability to export oil and gas with their so-called shadow fleet through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. And of course, he could do things working with Saudis and others to manipulate the prices that would bring it down so low that it would wreck Russia. So he had leverage, and maybe he's at the point now where he's going to use it.
That'd be interesting. And of course, maybe inadvertently, his damage to the economy is going to collapse hydrocarbon prices, thereby inflicting maybe unintended damage on the Russian economy. And I'm going to try get some people who know more about the state of the Russian economy back on, because it seems it is in quite a parlous state, which is a good sign there. Still, despite all of this, despite the threats, despite the fact that Russia is committed, I think, to fighting through this year, possibly even next year, unless something pushes them to cease, we see a sort of a partial awakening in Europe, but it's still not got the sort of deterrent power one would hope for. At least that's my impression. We seem to also be looking at something like hybrid war as something that's compartmentalized from real kinetic aggression. It's a way of us being able to pretend that Russia is not really at war with us. How do we snap out of this? Because I think from our conversations, you would say it's obvious, as you know, Sir Richard Schiff would say, that we are in a multi-front, multimodal form of aggression with Russia, which could be classed as a war already.
Yeah, I think this use of the term hybrid actually makes it difficult for us, for leaders to be decisive and to explain to their populations why we have to do certain things. Because if it's hybrid, that somehow seems not as threatening or a little bit fuzzy versus, pure kinetic conflict. Whereas I don't think that the Russians, and here I would defer to you, but I don't believe that the Russians actually think of war or not war, but instead it's always somewhere on that spectrum doing different things. And so people like President Stubb of Finland, he's not confused about what the Russians are doing in the Baltic Sea. I think most of our allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're not confused about what's happening. But maybe in UK and France and Germany, Netherlands, they're not as determined yet. So it's probably going to take a tragedy or some other catastrophic event to people to really snap out of it and realize that the Russians are actually trying to undermine everything that we all care about, or we say that we care about. This is not just about Ukraine or maybe Moldova or Georgia, something like that. Now, I do believe I I'm partial to Germany because I live here and I watch closely, and I've been frustrated for years that our German allies don't do more. But there's a new government that's going to be in place here in the next few days, led by Friedrich Merz. So a CDU, CSU, SPD government. And if he does the things he has talked about doing over the last few months, I think we're going to see a much more forward-leaning Germany that has kind of been what's missing. UK and France have been more forward-leaning than I had expected, but still, that's not enough. To get Germany with its economic power and its population and its geography and the amount of money that they are now starting to put into the Bundeswehr, for example, um, I think this could be a difference maker. Now, I'm prepared to be disappointed here, but my sense with Germans that I speak to in different walks of life, they know that they have to. They don't want to be the leader. They don't want to say we're the leader, but I have encouraged them, lead by example. Just do. Just like the real leader on a football club is usually not the loudest guy, it's the one who always delivers. And I think that's a role for Germany here.
And of course, that could apply more pressure back onto UK and France. And certainly the UK has been getting behind a little bit in terms of, scale and volume, and even taking its own defense seriously. Now, that brings us to the Russian spring and summer offensives. And I've just done an episode, and it's interesting listening to it because there seems to be some truth in this. And it's by Girkin, who is a wanted Russian war criminal. He's the character who really sort of helped to kick this war off in the first place 11 years ago. He's now in jail because he was involved in the shooting down of MH17 by the Buk missile. But he's also been known to sort of speak truth to power, which is one of the reasons he's in jail as a traitor. Um, he's been saying that actually, the idea of Kursk was not to sit on Russian territory, but to draw Russian troops in. And indeed, Ukraine has retained a small pocket of troops, it's been said, in Kursk and made incursions in Belgrade and so on. What Gherkin's comment is that what Ukraine is trying to do is make sure that the front line is as broad as possible, as long as possible. So they're not after depth, they're after length, because that sucks in huge numbers of Russian troops. It means you don't have as much armor and personnel to mount extensive operations because they're just spread too thin, and you don't know where the next penetrative attack is coming from the Ukrainians. Does this sound plausible? And if you accept that we're in an attritional war, is this quite a sensible strategy?
So, every commander wants to have the initiative. And this has impressed me since Ukraine's attack into Kursk last year, that they could recognize that Russia did not have the ability to really break through and overrun their defenses way out in the Pokrovsk region, even though it was a terrible situation if you're a company commander there. The fact is, at the operational level, that they could see that the Russians were not going to be able to break through. There is no big exploitation force that could then race to the Dnieper and keep going. So they were then able to marshal the forces and launch this attack to get the initiative, to change the narrative, to draw away Russian troops, to create strategic problem also for the Kremlin, which they have done. And I think that they can see that Russia does not have the ability to still breakthrough at the operational level. There will be local penetrations, of course, but the ability to really the mobile forces on this battlefield, I don't think they exist, and the Russians have not demonstrated the ability to conduct large scale combined arms operations, with air power, integrating drones, artillery, and maneuver. I just don't think they have the capabilities to do that. So for Ukraine, being able to stretch it out exactly as you described makes enormous good sense from their side. It also reveals to me or illustrates that they have made significant improvements in their personnel system, that in what we would call the institutional army, the ability to recruit, train, outfit, and then provide forces to the operational force. If they're able to keep doing that sort of thing, what you just described, that means they're in a better place than maybe what we thought 8, 9, 10 months ago.
And a little more, let's say, organization, structure, and purpose. And I think there's evidence there as well that there is a certain revolution taking place in the Ukrainian army. They accepted some time ago, more than a year ago, that they just didn't have the people to conduct sort of traditional operations, especially ones with high casualty rates, and against sort of strong Russian defenses. So they've moved to more virtual forces. And that's not to say, and many people repeated this, the infantry still has an extraordinary vital role, a primary role, but they're making up for their deficit in numbers and I said they have some progress in training, getting people through that sort of training pipeline, but again, it's still not enough. So they're building these drone battalions. And there's a real revolution there, which because if you're just drafted into the army and you're not proactive, you might get sent to any unit. But if you volunteer, you can actually choose which unit you go into. It's a form of sort of uh, democratic choice. And of course, if you're tech savvy, smart, or an entrepreneur, you're going to want to end up in a unit where you're not given, senseless orders, where you do actually have a voice, and you can critique commanders if you think they're making the wrong decision. So it seems there's a kind of democratic technological revolution taking place. Of course, there are some poor guys who end up with Soviet-style leadership. And there, it's very difficult to get innovation and ideas up the chain. And sometimes you'll be asked to go and do a senseless operation, which is practically suicidal. But what's your impression there of this sort of democratic revolution, in an historical context? And do we have to take note, actually, in Western armies of that?
Well, the U.S. Army and the British Army and most of our NATO allies uh, have adopted a mission command type approach to tactical leadership. So, or, from the old German Auftragstaktik, where, the purpose is what's most important, and then the local commander figures out how, versus the large centralized, everybody has to go this way. I don't want to try to oversell that, but I mean that is kind of the expectation, that not that sergeants sit around and debate whether or not they're going to do what the captain said, but that the best officers are the ones that encourage the input, especially from the old wiser sergeants that have some experience. That is a significant departure for Ukrainian military, because 3, 4, 5 years ago, all of their senior officers would have been men who had been raised in the Soviet style in the schools, et cetera. And what happens, of course, in the crucible of conflict, that's where the better, more effective leaders emerge. And now Ambassador Zaluzhnyi, but when he was General Zaluzhnyi, that's what he was trying to do across the army, was to root out the old Soviet types, and to bring in or promote the young guys who had demonstrated this kind of approach that you're describing. And of course, when you think about the population of Ukrainian men that and women that are coming into the military now, most of them are young enough that they would have grown up post-Soviet, and been educated, exposed to the West, and so they're not as likely to just be that fodder.
Yeah, and important and results are showing, I think, from that. Um, this is perhaps an entertainment question, but because I'm not sure the strategic impact of it. But of course, we've got the 9th of May military parade in Moscow. Some commentators who I think have done some of the sort of best work in analysing what's going on in the public arena, people like Mick Ryan and Sir William Sheriff, have said that Moscow's military parade on May the 9th is absolutely a military target. And indeed the preparations for it. And in no way does it contravene the rules of war. What's your impression there? Would it be a strategic advantage for Ukraine to actually disrupt or prevent those 9th of May 80th anniversary Victory Day celebrations happening in Russia?
I think it's ludicrous that somebody would think it's not a legitimate target. I mean, just like a factory that makes weapons is a target. So of course, if you've got a large number of Russian troops that are out there in broad daylight that are parading with captured Ukrainian vehicles, they're celebrating whatever they think they accomplished against Ukraine. Of course, that's a target. And it's interesting, some of the comments I just read this morning where Medvedev said that, oh, we can't guarantee the safety of Kyiv if the Ukrainians attack our parade. I mean, that's almost comical, as if they could or even would try to guarantee the safety of Kyiv. And then President Putin, I think, said, I hope we don't have to use a nuclear weapon. I mean, this is classic Russian, putting those ideas out there to try and intimidate. But it looks like, based on reports I've seen, that several of the high level leaders who were planning to show up are coming down with various illnesses or travel conflicts and have decided they don't want to be there, in anticipation that there will be Ukrainian drones, either with explosives or blue and gold smoke or various other things that will be humiliating for the Russians. And I think this is where a real war leader would be doing things focused on winning the war, not holding a big stupid parade like this. Um, obviously, I guess President Putin feels this is a way to keep the spirits of his own population built up. But if I was advising President Zelensky, I would launch hundreds of drones of all types, and some of them will get through.
Someone has humorously called it the dronavirus, which is what all these leaders are catching, which prevents them from coming through.
I wish I had thought of that. That's
Um, so we're probably approaching the sort of last topic area because I know you've got you have extraordinary number of commitments and many interviews to do. Um, has the threat to Europe gone away though, despite, the weakness of the Russian economy, despite their equipment and personnel being spread very thin across the front lines, they do still seem able to produce a number of missiles to have ongoing attacks, and of course they have allies such as North Korea and Iran who are providing them with munitions. Is the threat to Europe still there? Do we still need to look to the Baltics and the Suwalki Gap and other sort of pressure points with a degree of nervousness?
I think that the threat is absolutely there, and but it would not be in the form of what we're seeing in Ukraine. The Russian objective, should they decide to attack beyond Ukraine, and I don't, whether it's Moldova, Georgia, or Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Suwalki corridor, as you mentioned, um, because their purpose would not be to overrun all these places. Their purpose would be to break NATO, to demonstrate that the alliance is not willing or able to respond, to actually come to the aid to under an Article 5 scenario to consider the attack on Lithuania as an armed attack on everyone. If they can do that and only two or three countries show up, I mean that would really be a crushing blow for the alliance. Uh, and unfortunately, U.S. commitment seems the fact that so many people question it right now is bad enough. And I think that could lead to a terrible miscalculation by the Russians that they think, well, okay, Poland will probably do something, but the Poles are so concerned about Poland that they'll be reluctant to even go up into Lithuania. Um, it's not a courage thing. This is strategic thinking, and the Poles will be thinking, of course, we're next. So I'm going to keep watching Belarus, what happens there. The unlikelihood of a large scale formation and type attack as we saw in February 22, but instead something that clearly is an armed attack against NATO countries involving missile and air missile strikes against seaports, that transportation infrastructure, unmistakable but intended to see, will the alliance actually respond? And if they don't, particularly the US, but if we don't, then I think the credibility of the alliance would be severely uh, damaged.
And it could be preceded by cyber attacks, gray zone attacks, ship sinking, mysterious things happening.
Yep.
And there's been some reluctance to acknowledge that these things are done by Russia. And yet, when you speak to experts, it's practically impossible to drag an anchor across the floor of the ocean and not notice if you're the captain of a vessel.
Yeah, of course. I mean, even if I was the captain of a ship with zero experience, I would know something is amiss. But all these things they're doing, damaging communications infrastructure, energy infrastructure, disruption, all of this is part of the preparation phase. These are not random activities. These are all deliberate aspects of the preparation phase that doesn't have a timed end, but an effect. To see what will we do? Can we get our shit together? Um, and again, I think I mentioned President Stubb earlier. I think he's trying to organize in the region, a response. The fact that Estonia seized a ship a couple of weeks ago, that's significant. And the rest of the nations in the Baltic Sea region need to be willing to do that as well.
Denmark too, and possibly other nations with a border there. And it does seem, I mean, the last area here. So now you have to jump off. It seems that with all of the stuff going on, and despite there now being a little bit of a sort of softening of Trump's sort of stance, Ukrainians have come to the conclusion, I think, that fighting is the least worst option in the circumstances, rather than capitulating to Russian demands or Russian demands that are amplified by the US. I think they've decided some time ago that taking charge of their own defense is going to be the only option for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. They see no positive outcome accepting any bad deal that was brokered by the Trump administration. I think they do get some hope from European countries beginning to show some more strategic spine and their own capabilities. I mean, what you have seen firsthand, their ability to produce is increasing while they are at war. Um, so it seems to me that they are in a place psychologically as well as physically that they're going to keep doing this because they can see that the other side is staggering and that the Russians depend almost completely on Iran and China. And so none of this is happening in a vacuum.
Ben, always a huge privilege to be able to speak to you, and I'm sure there will be a lot to talk about when we come together again to discuss the progress of the war and Ukraine's move towards victory. For today, though, thank you so much for coming back and sharing your insights with our audience.
Well, thanks again for the privilege. I love watching your program as well as getting the occasional chance to be on it. So thank you.
It's tremendous that I'm able to have the luxury to be able to fire questions at you, and it's always a thrill as well.